I'd now like to introduce our incredible speakers who have dedicated many years to studying Fanon's work. We're very grateful to them for taking time out of their schedules to speak with us all today. Azzedine Haddour is Professor of Francophone and Comparative Literature at University College London and specialises in post-colonial literature. He is the author of Frantz, Fanon, Post-Colonialism and the Ethics of Difference. Azzedine was recently awarded a Leverhulme Research Fellowship to carry out his project, Frantz, Fanon, Gender, Torture and the Biopolitics of Colonialism. Lewis Gordon is professor at the University of Connecticut, who works in the areas of Africana philosophy, existentialism, and political theory. Lewis has written extensively on post-colonial thought, race and racism, and the works of W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon. His most recent book is What Fanon Said, a philosophical introduction to his life and thought. Azzedine and Lewis, thank you so much again for joining us today. I'd like to begin with a personal question and ask both of you, when you first came across Fanon's writing, what was your first reaction to it, and how has it influenced your research over the years? Azzedine, I think we'll start with you, and then we can go to Lewis.
I encountered Frantz Fanon when I was studying for my baccalaureate. The first text that I read by Frantz Fanon was The Wretched of the Earth, Les Damnés de la Terre. And I must say, the way I received The Wretched of the Earth, it was completely different. My personal experience in post-colonial Algeria and the rhetoric, the nationalist rhetoric, post-colonial Algeria, determined the ways in which I read the text. And then I never showed any interest in Frantz Fanon. I went to Sussex to study English literature, and then I discovered Black Skin, White Mask after it was reissued by Pluto in the 1986 edition, prefaced by Homi Bhabha. Homi Bhabha used to be at Sussex University when I was studying at Sussex for my PhD. I was working on Albert Camus, and I paid scant attention to Frantz Fanon. And towards the end of my research, I discovered not only the Wretched of the Earth, Black Skin, White Mask, I rediscovered the Wretched of the Earth. And my discovery was completely extraordinary. It reshaped my research. I would have written my thesis on Camus differently. I discovered not only Frantz Fanon, but aspects of my personal history. And I will return to talk about these aspects later on.
Thank you, Azzedine. Lewis?
Well, thank you, Brekna, for organizing this, and also for the community who has shown up on Zoom. And before we began, Azzedine and I was speaking, and again, my condolence, Azzedine. He lost his mother to COVID. And I'm sure there are those among you who have lost loved ones. I wrote something recently on loss, where one of the things I mentioned in the open paragraph that many, unfortunately, some of the uncaring, apathetic souls who are governing us these days forget, is that when we lose someone we love, we lose what is irreplaceable. And many of us are dealing with this question of this irreplaceability in our lives. So to those of you who have lost loved ones, and also just the fact that humanity is losing so many people, it's my condolence. Okay.
Thank you.
But the thing I've seen over the years about Fanon, and all of us have this story, which is people encounter Fanon in stages. And it's connected to the fact that what's extraordinary, there are many extraordinary things about Fanon, but it's really unusual for somebody to write to live for such a short time, and almost everything he's written is something great. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I often mention to my students, it's always funny to me whenever students say, oh, Capital, I've read that. Or, The Phenomenology of Spirit, I've read that. Or The Prison Notebooks, I've read. I always point out, you've never read a great book. You are reading a great book. A great book is a book that brings you back to it. And that's because over and over, every time, you learn something new. So I've always said, I've never read Fanon, I'm reading him. And my first encounter was actually when I was in my childhood. I'm from a very mixed family of Palestinian Jews, Sephardic Jews from Ireland, Tamil Indians, Chinese from Guangdong, Ethiopians, Egyptians, and Liberians. So to give you an idea. And you put that together in the island of Jamaica, and it's a perfect recipe for Rastafarians. And my mother's brothers, although they're born Jewish, they were also Rastafarians. And one of the things about them, particularly one of my uncles, his name is Salim. My uncle loved to buy Black liberation books. He just didn't read them. So as a child, I had this pile of Black liberation books all around. And I was a very avid reader. I loved reading. I began reading very early, to the point where I loved reading so much that I mentioned in another interview, I got to the point where I would run out of stuff to read when I was isolated in the mountains at one point, and found ways to just procure books. I won't say how, just to read. So you could imagine having this little treasure trove. So I opened up and there was Pour Noir Messe Blanc, Black Skin, White Mass. And there was also Le Dernier de la Terre, Wretched. And I tried to read them, and it's one of those things where the prose are just so gorgeous that I knew I was reading something special, but I didn't quite have the reference point to understand it. But I just kept trying. I knew this is something I had to keep returning to. So to make a long story short, over the years, I noticed among the people that I would be discussing Fanon with, and that's because as an adolescent I played with older jazz musicians, were jazz musicians. I'm a professor, but if you were at a jazz musician's home, a bookshelf like this would be in a jazz musician's home. A lot of classic Black jazz musicians just read a lot, and a lot of people have no idea how revolutionary they were. So I'll go to their homes and we'll talk these ideas. And it was pretty clear, if you think of somebody like Max Roach, if you look at the Freedom Now suite, you could hear Fanonian elements in there. You could see this in terms of how they deal with the struggles. But the first time academically, I looked at Fanon, because I was not assigned him once as an undergraduate, was when I was a graduate student. There was a professor who was also a Black liberationist, radical nun. And she was teaching in the Yale Divinity School. I wasn't in Divinity School, I was in Arts and Sciences, but I took her course and it was on political theology. And she assigned Le Dernier de la Terre. Now at that point, I read it through a different lens because I was bringing something to the text. And what led me to go to graduate school was because I was interested in the question of human potential. It always struck me that when you treat people like human beings, when you respect their humanity, they grow. And when you degrade them, when you reject them, when you don't acknowledge their humanity, they wither. And at first I thought about it in many classical terms, such as potentia in Aristotle. But when I came across Sartre, and now reading Fanon in a different way, I came across Fanon before Sartre, I realized that when all is said and done, this is really talking about the dignifying force of freedom, that what is involved in being a human being, and the idea that as a human being, you cannot be properly a human being passively. As he said in his earlier work, you need to be actional. So there's much more that's involved, but that's where I first academically encountered him. And it was a very special moment when I was writing my dissertation that my advisor, who was a very unusual man, Maurice Nathanson, who grew up in Yiddish theater, he just said, Fanon. He just had to pause and just say, Fanon, now we've entered the world of real thinking. And I'll leave it at there because there'll be time for us to communicate with the audience, but that's where, and because the rest of the stuff I've written in terms of Fanon, people are familiar with.
Thank you both. And yeah, I completely agree. It's not, obviously the ideas in the book are so powerful, but the way that it's written and the prose and the form of it is also incredibly beautiful. Louis, elsewhere you both discussed, you both briefly mentioned Black Skin, White Masks, and elsewhere you contrast that book with The Wretched or The Damned of the Earth, as you prefer to call it. The former exploring the colonized as locked in this dynamic of imitation, similar to Shelley's Frankenstein, and the latter calling on to future generations to go beyond imitation and go beyond the measurement of the self according to the standards of the colonizers and to create a new human. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the development of Fanon's writing and in particular his engagement with humanism.
Sure. The first thing is the reason I prefer for some people may wonder why I don't say wretched of the earth, why I prefer, the damned. And part of this is because in the English language, wretched has a different connotation than damned. You see, you can be damned through no fault of your own, you see. But wretchedness almost affirms the idea that there is something wrong with you. But a lot of Fanon's arguments, a lot of his work, it's about the question of what's wrong with a system that imposes upon you the idea of your condemnation. And so one of the things throughout Fanon's writings we should bear in mind is that Fanon was acutely aware that it's not simply about what you're saying, because Fanon was also a relational thinker. A lot of the what is manifested in the how. And as a child, Fanon loved poetry. It's very funny, as a child, he was often called Bergson because he was a kid who loved to read philosophy books and we already are familiar with the context with négritude poetry, but by the point in his adolescent years when he got to meet and he got to know Césaire. But the thing about the humanism for Fanon is that Fanon was a critic of reductive humanism. Reductive humanism treats the human being as a fixed, complete thing. But part of the problem with colonization, among the fact that it sucks, is the fact that it also creates a skewed notion of the idea that you can be who you are completely independent of your relationships. But Fanon was aware that our relationships were constitutive. But it's not just, but it's not simply relationships as things, as connections, but also as mode of actions. And what I mean by this is Fanon was aware that in the very methodology, in the very mode of presentation, that there can be an expression of colonization as well. So part of his argument was that the very idea of the human being, conceptually, was also colonized. But the colonization, and this pops up in The Damned of the Earth very beautifully, it is such that if it's done at the methodological level, at the very modus operandi, then it is possible that one may imagine one is emancipated while maintaining the practices and grammar of colonization. This is part of his critique of the post-colonial bourgeoisie, okay? That ultimately, although they say the nation is independent, they remain within the very structures of the ways of producing what is called a human. That's a very inhumane or very dehumanizing way of thinking of the human. So Fanon's humanism is a humanism that's actually what we could call a critical humanism. And why I call it a critical humanism is because Fanon knew we had to talk about the human being, mainly because of something I talk about in a book I wrote called An Introduction to Africana Philosophy. And what that is that Euromodern society imposed upon the globe two fundamental assaults. One was the assault on humanity itself. In other words, if you're enslaved, you're colonized, you're degraded. If you're told you're a piece of property, you're a thing, then the question, as he says in the Damned of the Earth, later on in the penultimate chapter, in reality, what am I? That's another way of saying, am I a human being? But Fanon also pointed out that enslavement, colonization, exploitation, all those categories are assaults on freedom. And so the question is then, in what sense, what am I is linked to the question of freedom. And this dialectical relationship between freedom and understanding of the self leads to a critical question of what does it mean, not only to be human, but what does it mean even to question what it means to be human? And this is one of the reasons why Fanon put it up a notch, because Fanon then is asking the question of whether our practices of justification are justified. You see, that's the level of radicality. So this is what many people miss. They think Fanon is doing the whole naive, which is actually ultimately a liberal pronouncement of humanism. But no, not at all. He's doing a relational radical question of praxis. In other words, he argues our humanity actually comes out of actions that are premised upon the furthering of freedom. But I'll leave it there. There's a lot more, but I think that could give a little context.
Thank you, Lewis. Azzedine, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about Fanon's engagement with Marxism, and particularly his approach to the roles of the proletariat and the peasant masses and the lumpen proletariat in the context of the Algerian Revolution and decolonization.
Absolutely. A number of critics tend to oppose black skin, white mask to the Wretched of the Earth. Some underscore the psychoanalytical dimension of black skin, white mask and the political radicalism of Fanon in the Wretched of the Earth. If we read carefully, as Lewis argues, you could see Fanon grapples with the issue of colonialism and its impact on the individual, the ways in which colonialism dehumanizes the individual. And in an article which I've written recently, you could argue that the Wretched of the Earth is a critique of Hegel. He starts his discussion with Hegel and the issue of slavery, the master-slave dialectics in Black Skin, White Mask. In the Wretched of the Earth, he reenacts the dialectic. He reenacts the dialectic in order to put Hegel on his head, announcing a new sort of humanism. And this humanism cannot come about without decolonialization. And he tackles this in the opening chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, when he talks about decolonization is a creative process. But as he is engaging with Hegel, he is also talking about Marxism, and he is trying to rethink class struggle in a kind of from a colonial perspective. Now, if we really want to understand The Wretched of the Earth, the history of the French Revolution, and in relation to the issue of slavery, but also the colonial question, as the bourgeois society was establishing itself in France, France was also, becoming colonial. And in fact, the history of Algeria's colonization was bound up with the history of the French Republic. When he talks about the proletariat or the lumpen proletariat in The Wretched of the Earth, some people very quickly think that these categories, these class categories, are universal and homogeneous, when in fact they're not. In The Wretched of the Earth, he takes two arguments. He makes two arguments against Marxism, phase as a step towards emancipation. The bourgeois stage, from his perspective, is absolutely useless. It leads us to a bland alley. You cannot achieve decolonization, as Lewis mentioned. The second issue that he takes against Marxism, he rejects Marx's assertion that the lumpen proletariat is not a revolutionary class. And here, really, I need to take you, through the history of Algeria's colonization, which he really maps beautifully, in his critique of French colonialism. When the French colonized Algeria, the colonization of Algeria coincided with the July Revolution. Algeria was made into a French department in 1848, after the constitution of the Second Republic. And the French army, which fought in Algeria to colonize Algeria, they are recruits from what Marx will call the lumpen proletariat, those who existed at the margins of the productive process. That is to say, thieves, prostitutes, criminals were recruited. The refuse of bourgeois society were mobilized and taken to Algeria to colonize Algeria. But even in Marxist theory, the lumpen proletariat is not a coherent category. It refers to the law of the law, the scum, as Sartre calls them, but also to finance, aristocracy. And it's these two components of the French society that were involved in the colonization of Algeria. Laws were passed in colonial Algeria, two laws. The first one is the Senatus Consult of 1863 and the Varnier Law of 1873. These laws work to dispossess the Algerians, take from them the land, and this land was made available for settlements. And the so-called lumpen proletariat, those who went to colonize Algeria, were not the bourgeois, those who existed at the margins of the French society. And you could see Fanon there in discussion with Sartre. a piece which I have translated, Colonialism is a system, le colonialisme est un système. This system took place in the second empire, after the establishment of the Second Republic. And Sartre makes the point that this class, the lumpen proletariat, was deployed, was used to put in place the colonial structures in Algeria. And Sartre argues that capitalism at that point became colonial. France needed, as a capitalist economy, needed markets. It needed outlets for its industrial products. And Algeria was a market. Other colonies were, potential markets for French industry. And it needed to create a purchasing power. And the purchasing power is not going to come from dispossessed Algerians. How do you create that purchasing power? You dispossess the natives, you give the land to the settlers, you create needs, and you open markets. And paradoxically, you basically turn a lumpen proletariat, European lumpen proletariat, into a bourgeois class, and you create another lumpen proletariat, the one that Fanon talks about in The Wretched of the Earth. This lumpen proletariat in Algeria is a peasant class, which is dispossessed and marginalized. And it's that class that Fanon talks about. And he makes the point eloquently. The only revolutionary class is not the proletariat. It is the lumpen proletariat, that mass of people that were colonized, marginalized, the landless peasants. That is the most revolutionary class in colonial Algeria. And I stop here.
Thank you.
Could I just add
absolutely.
Could I add 3 points? Yeah, I'd like to just add 3 points. One is logical, the other one is sociological, and then the last one goes back to your point about Frankenstein. The logical point is a rather interesting one, because there were people who read Marxism and Hegelianism in a way that began to impose positivist science on dialectical science. And this is something where a certain period in his effort to reach out to dialectical thought that Sartre had collapsed into when he wrote Au fait noir, right? A Black Orpheus. And in Black and White Mass, Fanon had criticized Sartre about this. But a lot of people miss the criticism when they read it. What Fanon was bringing up was that there's a problem in contrarian binary logic. And this problem in contrarian binary logic is that it creates a world of a universal positive, which has implicit in it the notion of a universal negative. Now, when this assertion was there, this led to a naive form of dialectics that many people learn in school, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The problem with that is that it has an overdetermined outcome and presumption of a synthesis. It doesn't follow that if you encounter the contradictions, you will have a synthesis. And this is because a lot of people who read dialectics often don't think about contradictions. And what happens with a contradiction is that it's the collapse of a universal category, but now you face the many possibilities of the directions you can go in when you realize that collapse. The reason this is crucial when he gave that criticism of Sartre is because it connects to the naive form of Marxism that really treats the categories as fixed, right? Which relates to what Azzedine was talking about. This is what would make people look at the Haitian Revolution, for instance, and say it's not a revolution because it doesn't have X, Y, and Z, okay? It doesn't have a proletariat this way, a bourgeoisie this way, etc. However, if you now get into meta theory, which is the theory about the theory, that would in effect mean that dialectics are closed. But that would eliminate the possibility of praxis, because praxis would now cease to have possibility. It would just be the predetermined outcome, you see, of a given situation. When Marx is actually arguing that within every situation, there are contradictions, but you don't have an advanced knowledge of the outcome. Now, once we begin to see this, this is what led Sartre to begin to give a critique now of dialectical reason, okay? Which is why he had to look at the Algerian context as an example, okay? So that's the first thing there, and this is why in The Damned of the Earth, Fanon opens the book with the contraries, and to point out that once you have those absolutes, you only have violence. A lot of people don't realize that what he's arguing, despite that effort to create the segregation of a colonized society, there is a mediation, a contradiction that's happening daily, and that's with the violence through the police and other mechanisms. And so once we understand that, then we come to this next understanding, which is connected to your earlier question, that human beings don't live in worlds of contraries. Communication would never occur. Human beings live in worlds that are actually always in dialectical connection, which means that the communicative practices are always dealing with contradictions. So this means that if we pick a category, for instance, a lot of people would look at the lumpen proletariat, but Fanon was also actually arguing there's a lumpen bourgeoisie, particularly in other words, what was imposed on the colonies was this new category. And it's very important to understand this category because Fanon actually knew E. Franklin Frazier. E. Franklin Frazier was at the Black Writers' Congress in 1954 in Paris. And he wrote a book called Bourgeoisie Noire, okay? Black Bourgeoisie. And his critique of the very idea of black bourgeoisie was that if you look carefully, a lot of what's called the black bourgeoisie were not directly linked to the development of material capital. In other words, their wealth was a function of race mediation, you see? And that means then that they were actually a form of dependent bourgeoisie on the old order, which is an argument that Fanon uses in The Damned of the Earth, that you have the independents, but now you have a class that pops up who are linked actually to the negotiating the colonial relationships, a lumpen bourgeoisie, rather than one that's directly connected to the material contradictions of the actual society at the point of independence. And if I'm to make it more concrete to the audience, what Fanon is saying is something like this. Okay, fine, you could declare an independent South Africa, or an independent Kenya, or an independent Ghana, or Nigeria, or independent India, right? You declare those, right? You have all these categories. But if you look carefully, what the people do at the moment of independence is they get now involved in the interactive contradictions of the zeitgeist, of the times. They dress differently, they create creolized elements, there's Algerian jazz, there's Sudanese hip hop, you know, that kind of a thing, right? But if you look at the institutions of power, they remain intact in their colonial form. The governing offices and the British ones look like Parliament. They have the structure of the churches. There's going to be educational system of the colonial system. Now, what would fit the people in this post-colonial environment? What would they be building? So this comes to the last part I was going to say, why I brought up that Frankenstein example. I wrote an essay on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and how Mary Shelley and Fanon are connected. And what Frankenstein is very similar to Pan Noir Mas Blanc, to Black Skin White Mass, because the question there in the novel and in Black Skin White Mass is about the trap that comes in when what is produced. Victor Frankenstein produces the creature, produces a colonized subject, the expectation of imitation. In other words, to see in the face of the colonized the mirror image of the colonizer. Victor Frankenstein wanted his own face in the creature. But what the creature made the mistake of was constantly trying to get Victor to realize that the question at the end of, but that is the mistake, because he cannot autonomously produce from that model with the dependency of reproduction. There needed to be a movement into what is involved in building a society that's premised upon its own terms of freedom that may actually be appropriate for the conditions at hand. And that's why that creature was actually the creature that's overcome imitation. And if you look in the Land of the Earth, Fanon explicitly says the problem with the post-colonial bourgeoisie, which he's calling basically a lumpen bourgeoisie, is that they are locked in the logic of imitation. They're imitating the metropole, the colonized environment. But what they actually need to do is actually to be connected and to the creativity needed to build actually new conditions, new values, he argues, and new concepts that would actually be more appropriate for the building of freedom. And from the standpoint of a colonized environment, that would be monstrous. You see, that's why the creature is a monster. But from the standpoint of struggling for liberation, it means then that this form of radicalism is taking a form of radical responsibility for concepts that are always fundamentally incomplete. In other words, it's the difference that is produced. That is now going to lead to, and there are lots of things he says in the book, you know, why at the moment of independence is there a capital city, for instance? Or why in the tropics are we having these tall buildings that are trying to look like Paris or London, when in fact there may be a very different organization of citizenship and political life. Anyway, that's just a hint at it.
Mm. Thank you both. We know that Fanon practiced as a psychiatrist in Algeria, treating patients who were both the colonizers and the colonized. What does he tell us about mental illness in colonial society? Maybe we can begin with you, Azzedine.
Yes. I want to talk about a couple of things before I turn to this question. Yeah, and I really want to underscore what Lewis was saying. You know, the concluding part of the Wretched of, you know, as he was critiquing Hegel, let's find and discover a new humanity. Let's create a new language, you know, to kind of, you know, to achieve this freedom. I think, you know, he was possibly there, you know, where he is talking about a central issue that even our leaders in the third world and in Africa, you know, he seems to basically he seemed to capture really the issue of the pitfalls of decolonialization, really. The pitfalls of decolonization, a decolonization which is not a decolonization. And And that's my experience in Algeria. I read The Wretched of the Earth. I read it through, kind of, a nationalist rhetoric. I never discovered what he really meant in The Wretched of the Earth. And it took me years of research to kind of, discover, the crux of the issues in the Wretched of the Earth. But, people talk about violence in The Wretched of the Earth, and they seem to dwell on the violence in the opening chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, and they forget a different type of violence that he talks about in the concluding chapter of The Wretched of the Earth. Violence, colonial violence, and its impact on colonial society. How, kind of the mental illness was manufactured and produced by colonial violence. A number of cases that he documents as he was practicing in Blida, he discusses these cases. I could return to talk about them later on, but he talks about that type of violence in relation to the school of Algiers of psychiatry. And this school of psychiatry posits that Algerians are born criminals. They are born criminals. They are inherently violent. And this school of thought, basically, if we do a little bit of basic research, we realize that a number of doctors that went to Algeria, like Bodichon or Boisier, another military doctor, were influenced by Moreau. Moreau wrote a text on mental illness in 1843, and the title of the book is Recherche sur des aliénés en Orient. Moreau argues that climatic conditions and cultural factors contributed to this strange phenomenon in the Orient. He noted that in the Orient, madness is less frequent, and that's due to the climate, but also to cultural factors. Islam was a factor. Muslims do not suffer from mental illness because of their cognitive constitutions, he argues. And for him, mental illness is a manifestation of civilization, of progress, whereas the Algerians do not suffer from this issue because they are not mentally there. They're not developed like Westerners, so they cannot manifest mental health issues. Boisier comes along with Porot. Fanon talks about Porot in the Wretched of the Earth, and they basically put Moreau on his head. He said, in fact, Islam is a manifestation of disease and mental health. The Algerians are born violent and mentally deficient. And the last section, where he talks about the cases that he documents in Algeria, and he talks about Poirot, and he makes the point eloquently. He argues that the colonial system produced madness. When he was doing his research in Blida and he wanted to put in place the communal therapy, it didn't work because the structures, medical structures in the hospital replicated social structures. Muslims were kept separate from Europeans. Plus, the issue of assimilation was a real issue. The French, when they talked about assimilation, assimilation meant what? Did it mean cultural integration? No. Assimilation meant the expropriation of land. Two laws were passed, I mentioned this earlier in the talk. Le Senatus Consult of 1863 led to the expropriation of land, the assimilation of land into French law. But also, another law was passed, Le Senatus Consult of 1865. It stipulated that the Algerians can assimilate, provided they relinquish their Islamic status. Religion was a factor in this process of naturalization. We know the consequences of assimilation. We know assimilation never led to assimilation. It led to segregation. It led to expropriation. And Algeria was in the grip of famine from 1868, dreadful famine, up to its independence in 1860. I remember when I was a kid, scavenging from dustbins. And it's this that Fanon talks about. He said, you starve the indigenous people, and the indigenous people become violent. He compares Algerian society to a farm. You starve, you starve the people, and it's like the rule of the pecking order. If you steal dates or you steal bread from your neighbor, it's not an infraction of the law. You are denying the existence of that individual. You're stealing livelihood. You're stealing livelihood. And it's this history that I could not understand when I was, I encountered the Wretched of the Earth initially. I understood my personal history. Land was taken. I'm Kabyle, I come from a specific tribe in Algeria. Land was taken from us. We were forced to immigrate. Yeah. Part of my family went to Morocco, the other part to Tunisia. I ended up in Tunisia, and some went to Syria. So, it's this, history that I discovered with Fanon.
Thank you, Azzedine. Louis, maybe you could, so one of the most misunderstood aspects of Fanon's work are his views on violence, which Azzedine briefly mentioned there. I wondered if you could contextualize his writing on this specific theme and perhaps explore why he's so often accused of saying things that he never actually did.
Well, sure. Well, there are several things that connect to some of the things we said earlier to understand what how he's talking about violence. And the issue is that it's multi-layered, okay? And why I say multi-layered is mainly because Fanon talks about violence dialectically, but there's also another context of talking about violence that's particularly peculiar to how Euromodern audiences respond to the very idea that a Black person or an indigenous person would talk about violence at all, okay? And this is, so I'd have to really address it at two levels. And it's related to the question you just asked when we talked about mental illness as well. So I'm going to just go backwards from the mental illness question to the violence question, okay? One of the things that Fanon noticed, and he actually had a hypothesis about this when he was a medical student, but it's also something he knows concretely, because we often forget that Fanon was not only a physician, he was not only a philosopher, but he was also, and he was not only a psychiatrist, he was two kinds of psychiatrists. He was a clinical psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist. But Fanon was also a soldier. He was actually there witnessing concretely the horrors of World War II. But not just, and in his case, it was not simply what he saw in Europe, but also what he saw concretely on the ground in North Africa, okay? So he was able to witness, as we could say, the ugly underside of French colonial society. In other words, on the one hand, he's looking at the Nazis, German society, whom the French are fighting, okay? But at the same time, he's witnessing the ugly underside of the side he's on, because we have to remember the way the Black soldiers were treated in World War II. The fact that Fanon, right, and his fellow soldiers, and also there were women fighters. A lot of people they forget about this, that the volunteers who went from Martinique or Guadeloupe to go fight for France were also Black women. That they were put in the hulls of ships with just biscuit and sent back ahead, so there could be the sight of just white soldiers triumphantly returning from World War II, okay? So he has all of that there. But one of the things he noticed when he was an intern, when he was a medical intern, was that there would be people who would come to him who were suffering, but were not mentally ill. The thing was, in other words, they were suffering from believing they were mentally ill, but ultimately what was the source of their suffering was the degradation, was the unequal treatment, was also the times from the police and from the boss, from all levels of degradation they were experiencing in that society. And what Fanon realized, that a person who is upset at that is actually a healthy person. In other words, one of the goals of colonialism was to create the happy slave. And what Fanon was immediately realizing, there's something indecent about someone who's just happy and at home with her or his degradation, okay? But that was the model. As we know, under enslavement in the United States, there was in the psychology books, there was an illness called drapetomania. And drapetomania was defined as basically an enslaved person seeking freedom. So the idea that seeking freedom could be called a mental illness, that tells you something is wrong with that system. And so what Fanon began what he began to look at very early on is the distinction between neurological or physical illness and mental illness. And again, it will take up too much time for me to get into details here, but a lot of what Fanon's discussion of mental illness connects to is also his discussions of narcissism. He actually argues that colonialism creates fundamentally for the colonizer a form of mental illness, which is malignant narcissism. And all I got to tell you is, if many of you go and look at most health studies today of malignant narcissism, just look at the symptoms. If you were to look at the system and just check off white supremacy next to it, every symptom of malignant narcissism maps on to the theses of white supremacy in Euro-modern society, every single one. Just go and do it. You'll see what I'm talking about. So, and that's why one of the things Fanon talks about was narcissism quite a bit. His dissertation, which looked at Friedreich's ataxia, looked at patients whose neurological conditions were degenerative, but he noticed that mental illness was not uniformly there among those suffering from the disease. And so this was a form of empirical proof of the disaggregation of mental illness from neurological illness. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, I bring this up mainly because from the standpoint of a colonial society, everything the settler has is just, in a nutshell. In other words, the possession of the land, the benefits, the resources, all of that. So if the argument is that the system is just, then injustice would be to change that system, to take those things away from those people, to do whatever. Now, the reason this is legitimate to have a system that's premised on the disempowerment of a people, then the presumption is that their empowerment is illegitimate. This is the reason why in the United States, as an example, there's still to this day debate over Black power, because the premise of that society is that it's legitimate when Black and Indigenous peoples are disempowered. So the thing about empowerment is that if you're empowered, you can appear. But if the argument is that you are an illegitimate site of power, then your very appearance would be illicit. So the construction is of the idea of what I call illicit appearance, the idea of putting together Black and power or Indigenous and power becomes something that is considered wrong. So that in itself is treated as violence. So here you have the catch-22. If you go back to the earlier point about contraries, colonialism produces systems of contraries. So there's a universal negative. The settler has the right to everything. That's the malignant narcissism, okay? Which means that the colonized don't have a right to anything. You see what I'm getting at? So once that's the logic of what's considered nonviolence, that means the everyday existence for the colonized is an everyday existence of disempowerment. In other words, an everyday existence of ongoing violence. You see what I'm getting at? And this is one of the reasons why, for instance, the police function the way they do. Because if the police, most of the times the police will pursue a person of color, but say in the United States, Black, or in Fanon's context, Berbers and Arabs, and also Blacks, the crime that is committed is actually listed after the person has been apprehended, which means what stimulates the pursuit is the very appearance of that person. You see what I'm getting at? So in other words, that's what it means literally to appear as a crime. So what Fanon is basically arguing is this, and this is why I say it's too multi-layered. The very idea that Fanon would say it's a waste of time to prove you're nonviolent. It's just a waste of time, because the only condition under which the settler will accept you as nonviolent is if you don't change the system. The very changing and transforming of the system is for the settler an injustice. And that's what that means then. What Fanon's saying is you're wasting your time to persuade them. As long as you're transforming and changing that society, that the settlers' society is going to call that violence, okay? So now we get to the question, once we realize this then, the reason Fanon is misunderstood is because he never apologized. He's unapologetic about talking about violence. And that unapologetic talking about violence is one of the nightmares of that system. And so it's projected on him, the misrepresentation of what he's saying. For many in the audience, this would be rather shocking. Fanon was actually hated violence. He saw violence as something that degrades people. You see? So, but here's his point. If you hate violence, but you do nothing about violence, then you're actually maintaining a system of violence. And those are the people who are actually producing the ongoing colonial violence. But if to understand violence is to stop it, then you have to accept that it's a dirty affair, and you will have the appearance, the manifestation of violence. But here's the crucial thing. The thing is, there's a lot more going on in trauma theory and a lot of other areas of research. The thing to bear in mind with Fanon is there's a reason why in the later part of the text, he has this section on violence and disorders. If Fanon's aim was to romanticize anti-colonial violence, to romanticize it, he would not have presented those case studies of little boys who killed their best friend, of a man who kills a woman who didn't personally hurt him, but he thought about his dead mother, etc. Fanon is trying to show that the very process of the transformation is trauma-inducing, it's not romantic, and that he's showing that this is what a systemic violence produces. But Fanon is also given a second argument that many people overlook when he talks about violence. Because what Fanon is showing in that process is that although those people are in effect sullied by violence, and it's a necessary violence, because if they don't do anything, they will have to live in a condition of ongoing dehumanization. What Fanon then moves to, and this is the crucial point, is to ask the question as a psychiatrist: do you want the next stage, the post-colonial stage, to be dominated by people whose skill set is premised upon the trauma of violent engagement? You see? And this is very crucial because, you see, a lot of the people who are part of the transition, if their legitimacy depends on violence, then the subsequent society, the one you're building beyond the moment of independence, would be entrapped in legitimating practices premised upon ongoing violence. So Fanon, this is why Fanon is so critical of the post-colonial bourgeoisie, because he argues that there has to be a generation whose set of relations to building up the country, the nation, the institutions, etc., are cultivated on something other than violence. Because right now the condition is not one of having a structural settler. It's one now in a dialectical relationship actually to the people who brought in the moment of emancipation. And so the new dialectical opposition becomes directly between the people in the post-colonial state and the post-colonial lumpen bourgeoisie. Anyway, that's a little bit of it. So his view on violence has to be understood more dialectically. It has to be understood that it's paradoxically the question of what it is to build a society based on empowerment versus a society based on disempowerment.
Thanks, Lewis. We're almost out of time, but Azzedine, I just wanted to ask you about your recent research, which explores Fanon's writing in relation to gender, torture, and the biopolitics of colonialism. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about this project.
Yes, but I need to add one thing to what Lewis is saying. Fanon risked his life twice to fight for justice and freedom, to uphold these two ideals. The first one is when he was 17, 18 years of age, he went to fight the Nazi and protect his mother country, France, and uphold the Republican ideals. It's the same Fanon that took arms against France to uphold exactly the same principles. It's the same Fanon, and people tend to kind of, idealize the first Fanon. He basically risked his life, to kind of, protect Mother France. And very quickly they rush to basically kind of denounce the violence in Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, when basically he is quite explicit. Colonialism is a violent system, is a system that engenders violence, and there is no other way but to dismantle the structures of that system. And that's the crux of what he is arguing. The conclusion of The Wretched of the Earth is not celebrating violence. He is announcing a new humanity, trying to create a new language. Yeah, that's one point that I really wanted to add to Lewis's excellent discussion on violence. He wrote after the Battle of Algiers. Fanon was working in the Blida hospital, and he started to realize that he cannot do his job. He cannot practice in Algeria. He basically documents the cases that he outlines in on war and mental illness in The Wretched of the Earth. And he decides that the situation is not sustainable. He has to leave. And he starts to get involved with the FLN. And he is expelled from Algeria. He goes briefly to France, and he goes to Tunis. Whilst he was in Tunis, he has this idea to write a text when he was working in Charles Nicolle Hospital, and the title of the text, L'Enseigne de la Révolution, translated as Studies in a Dying Colonialism. And the text is dated. Nobody seems to pay attention to that text. It sounds like a piece of counter propaganda, to be fair. In there, he talks about the impact of French colonialism on Algerian society. He deals with the issue of the radio, medicine, family structure, gender and the veil, also ethnic minorities. And I think, although the text seems to refer us, especially L'Algérie se dévoile, Algeria unveiled, seems to refer us to the Battle of Algiers. In fact, the text really doesn't refer us at all to the Battle of Algiers. The Battle of Algiers took place late 56 to late 57. Fanon left Algeria by then. It was the text he published in, I think, late 59. So basically, kind of, the text, although it refers us to a specific historical moment, the Battle of Algiers, in fact, it engages with other contexts. It engages with the fraternization demonstrations of May 58, the psychological warfare undertaken by the Fifth Bureau, the policy of resettling Algerians, the unspeakable issue of torture. So a number of issues that he deals with explicitly as well as implicitly. And one of the issues that I want to talk about is the issue of the veil. The piece Algeria Unveiled, or Algérie se dévoile, is clearly used by Porto Corvo in the movie The Battle of Algiers. The movie, reproduces, what Fanon calls the historical dynamism of the veil, when women used the veil, to carry bombs and arms to help the FLN, but also they abandoned the veil in order to do exactly the same thing, to assist the FLN and undermine French colonialism. But one key issue that is central to that discussion is a little footnote in the piece, referring us to May 58, when Algerian women were basically, the French army took these women, took a number of women, and they orchestrated these fraternization demonstrations, where basically Algerians are shown to support the colonial system, and women were made to unveil publicly under the chanting of Live de Gaulle, live French Algeria. And they were made to burn the veil publicly. And Fanon perceived that as a scene of public rape. And he was really quite worried that the French are trying to use gender to maintain French colonialism. And one point that I really need to underscore here, the French might have colonized Algeria. They might have taken the land. They might have dominated the Algerians, politically. But one thing that they could not conquer is the domestic space. The Algerians were excluded from the public space, that is to say, from politics, but the Algerians reenacted their sense of cultural identity in the domestic sphere. And the last bastion that the French could not colonize is the Algerian woman. And from the late 30s, 40s, the French were trying to kind of, co-opt the Algerian woman. And in there, he makes it eloquently clear that, the psychological warfare is an issue, that the French are trying to use gender as a stratagem to maintain their hegemony in Algeria. A lot of feminist, feminism, first wave feminism, were basically demonizing the veil, were encouraging the woman, to basically open up, and so forth and so on. And that first wave of French feminism, the 30s up to the 50s. One thing that I really need to say: the number of French feminists who didn't have the right to vote till the Second World War, after the Second World War, made it their mission to go and liberate emancipate their oppressed Algerian women, when basically they did not have themselves the right to vote. And feminism and gender were issues. And Fanon was talking about family structure, about the need to decolonize sexuality and sexual politics. It is important. One reference in The Wretched of the Earth is that you cannot achieve decolonization without the emancipation of a large segment of the Algerian society. That is to say, the liberation of the Algerian woman. And he is talking about the new woman emerging on the scene in studies in the colonial, studies in the dying colonialism, in the same way as he's talking about the new man in The Wretched of the Earth. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Azzedine. I think that's all we have time for this evening, although I'm sure we all have many more questions to ask. I'd just like to say how grateful we are to both of our speakers for participating in this event. We feel very lucky to have been able to share this book with our subscribers. The ideas that we've covered today are really important ones that the left needs to engage with, and it's been very helpful and valuable to have both of you sharing your knowledge of Fanon's work with us. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and thanks all of you.
Thank you.
And for those of you who came, continue being safe and healthy, and despite the dire times, do find moments of joy. Because what's the point of fighting if you're not fighting for a life worth living? And that is ultimately Fanon's argument. You need to fight for a life worth living. What he said to his patients when they came to him, the clients, those he told that they were not ill, but they were suffering, his remedy was go out there and get engaged in a political struggle, and you will find yourself actually respecting yourself more, because your freedom is for you to seize. Freedom cannot be given to you. And the other thing that's very crucial when we think about Fanon in this respect is that Fanon ultimately took the position that there's something abhorrent about the task of a psychiatrist, who is to make people well. And part of making people well is to make them at home with their environment. If psychiatry is to make you at home with racism, sexism, homophobia, degradation of the human being, then there's something wrong with psychiatry. That was his critique. He argued we needed to have a better human science, and also as a teacher, as a liberator, when we're fighting the struggle related to the question of a left forum, that we have to understand that we are fighting for a situation in which we can build a society in which to be at home with that society, is to be at home with the dignity and freedom and respect for our fellow human beings.
Thanks so much, Lewis. Thanks also to our audience for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you here. Keep an eye on our social media channels and website for further events like this, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great seeing you, Feroz, and some of the others. I've seen wonderful messages on the chat. Thank you all. Okay.
Good night. Good night.
Okay.
Good night.